Hey Tom, what are you doing?
Hi Carmen, I'm going to show everybody how to perform lung ultrasound on yourself.
That's fancy.
So first thing is you want to find your clinically used ultrasound machine, make sure it's cleaned off, then make sure you have the correct probe selected. We're going to use the linear probe you use for central line placement anyway, and press the corresponding button.
What you guys doing?
Oh, we're doing lung ultrasound.
Huh?
Alright, so the next step is to apply some cold ultrasound gel to your probe. Carefully apply that probe to your chest and adjust the ultrasound so that you can see your pleural sliding. I'll come a little closer so you can see this better. As you might be able to tell, we have pleural sliding here and a rib visible. In order to see this image better, we're going to increase the depth by pressing on this button here. And once we have the appropriate depth, we'll slide around with the probe until we see a rib below and a rib above, and we'll focus on the pleural sliding. As proof that you're able to obtain this image, I would like to ask you to press the freeze button at this point. Put down the probe. And take a quick photo of the screen. And email that to me. The next step is to apply M mode. So once again, find the inner space with the nose pointed towards your head. This is the sagittal plane. Press the freeze button again. And once again, we're going to find the pleural space in between the ribs. Once we found that, we're going to press on the M mode button right here. M mode produces a line that is going to go through the pleural. If it goes to the rib, this won't work, so you'll have to slide back and forth until you hit the pleural. Then press M mode again. And while you're breathing, you should be able to detect the sandy beach sign. Waves hitting the sandy beach. When you've achieved that, hit the freeze button. Put down the probe. And once again, take a photo of the screen. The last part of the exercise is to demonstrate A-lines, which are artifacts that occur in the normal lung, but it can also occur in the setting of pneumothorax. Once again, unfreeze the screen by hitting the freeze button. Hit the 2D button. And now, since A-lines occur at multiples of the distance between the transducer and the pleura, we'll have to increase the depth to the maximum depth. And now we have to slip and slide the probe. So, as Carmen has zoomed in on this image, we can see the pleura sliding, and equidistant from the pleura is a second line. This is an artifact. This is the A line. I would like you to freeze the screen when you see the A line, and put down the probe, and simply take a quick snapshot and email that to Thomas Edrick. This concludes your practical portfolio exercise for the lung ultrasound study. Thank you very much.
Here is a brief review of lung ultrasound for the purpose of pneumothorax detection. In this first case, we can all see this lung sliding. Lung sliding in this algorithm is sufficient to rule out pneumothorax with certainty. In this patient, we see pleural sliding, and we also see comet tail artifacts. These are called B lines. They originate at the pleura and extend all the way down to the bottom of the screen. They represent an increased water content in the lung at the visceral pleural surface, such as pulmonary edema or interstitial pulmonary disease or atelectasis. When you see B lines, you know for sure there is no pneumothorax. B lines alone are sufficient to exclude pneumothorax. What about this patient? I can't be too sure there is really lung sliding, so I look at the M mode. We search for the pleural line and see rhythmic disturbances that are occurring beginning at the pleural line, not above it, not from the chest wall. These artifacts stem from cardiac pulsations transmitted through the lung to the visceral pleura. The visceral pleura moves slightly in apposition with the parietal pleura and causes these artifacts. This is called lung pulse. As we can see in this algorithm, lung pulse alone is sufficient to rule out pneumothorax. In this image, we can identify the pleura that's just below the ribs. And at twice the distance between the transducer and the pleura, we identify another white line. This is the so-called A line. It's created when waves bounce off the pleura, but then bounce off of the transducer surface, off the pleura again, and back to the transducer. The transducer is fooled into thinking that the reflection came from something that was twice the distance, and that's the creation of the A line. Note that there are other white lines that are similar. These probably originate from interfaces such as these fascial interfaces. Are A lines important in the detection of pneumothorax? They're not included in the algorithm. A lines are not important to determine pneumothorax, with the caveat that A lines will disappear if you see B lines. And B lines are sufficient to rule out pneumothorax. However, A lines themselves are not useful for detection of pneumothorax. Let's look at the findings you might expect in a typical ICU patient with some consolidations. First, we see obvious lung sliding. This is sufficient to rule out pneumothorax. Over another part of the lung, perhaps over the consolidated basal segments, we see faint B lines originating from the pleura and extending down to the bottom of the screen. This is also sufficient to rule out pneumothorax. Lastly, we place an M mode through a portion of pleura where we did not detect lung sliding. And here we see the pleura with rhythmic disturbances originating at the pleura. These are due to cardiac pulsations making the lung shiver and making the visceral pleura slide against the parietal pleura slightly, enough to create the artifact called lung pulse. Lung pulse is sufficient to rule out pneumothorax. In the algorithm once more, we've seen lung sliding, which rules out pneumothorax. We've seen B lines, which also rule out pneumothorax. And we've seen lung pulse, which also rules out pneumothorax. 3 findings which individually each rule out pneumothorax. Finally, let's look at a patient with a pneumothorax. Here we see a patient who's struggling to breathe. We identify the pleura by the rib that's next to it, and we see that the musculature of this patient is moving. There are fascial layers with muscles sliding. In the M mode, we identify the pleura, we identify the other fascial layers, we identify artifacts that are starting at these fascial layers. We do not really see artifacts that are starting at the pleural surface itself. So all these artifacts are coming from structures that are superficial to the pleura, most likely these sliding fascial layers. These are not B lines. Do not confuse these with B lines. These are artifacts stemming from the chest wall. Lastly, we see something called lung point. You can see the lung emerging from underneath this rib. This is the edge of the pneumothorax. There's pneumothorax here. This is the last portion of lung contacting the chest wall. This is a lung point, and this is a positive sign. Here we can see that lung point will rule in pneumothorax. It is a positive sign. If this patient were stable, this pneumothorax may have no clinical consequence. However, there may be high-risk situations such as pending mechanical ventilation or pending air transport, in which even a small pneumothorax may have clinical consequences and require decompression. Let's say you're dealing with a hemodynamically unstable patient who's just had a central line insertion. You can see no lung sliding. You see fascial sliding in this patient who's struggling to breathe. On the M mode, you don't see any convincing lung pulsations. Everything comes from layers that are superficial to the pleura. In this case, you see no lung sliding. You don't see B lines. You don't see a lung pulse. Let's say that you also cannot find a lung point. In this case, with a good mechanism and a patient who is hemodynamically unstable, you may assume pneumothorax, and it may be appropriate to decompress the patient's chest at this time point. Not finding a lung point in this situation would not be uncommon. In the setting of a tension pneumothorax, the lung collapses so much that none of it is in apposition with the chest wall. Therefore, you're not going to find a lung point. It would not be useful to waste much time searching for a lung point in this situation. If you have a clinically appropriate situation with a likely mechanism for pneumothorax in an unstable patient, you may assume the patient has a tension pneumothorax, and it may be appropriate to decompress the chest at this time. As you can see, many of these lung ultrasound findings will depend on the clinical setting. In the setting of an emergency such as this one, you may suspect tension pneumothorax, and it may be appropriate to act quickly. In other settings where the patient is stable, you may consider progressing to other diagnostic modalities to confirm your lung ultrasound findings. Thank you very much. This concludes the case series in your lung ultrasound tutorial.